I mean, these are people who came when the civil war was at its height in Somalia in the 1990s. These are not largely people who have come in the last few years. They want to do a crackdown there, and we've already seen, haven't we, the ICE raids around the country, people being literally snatched off the streets, and obviously they're getting very worried in Minnesota right now.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Trump World. Anushka, how was your Thanksgiving?
Oh, it was lovely. Thank you, Matt. I went to a beautiful place called Duck in North Carolina.
You had
Gorgeous
a turkey
beaches.
and duck. Very appropriate.
Amazing. And it was my first Thanksgiving in America. I've always done Thanksgiving in the UK, actually. But I didn't try. Have you ever tried... I forget what it is now with the marshmallows. Have you ever... It's sweet potato, isn't it?
I
Have you ever
tried. I make it. It's my signature dish. And it is...
Are you serious?
I
can't even
it.
imagine liking it. It sounds so disgusting.
Because it's really quite disgusting in some ways, because it's like chemistry on top of vegetables. I mean, marshmallows are probably the worst thing that mankind can ingest.
Well, today's not the day to discuss American food, but I have to say it's been one of the things I've found most interesting since I've been here. Now, do you know what Donald Trump did for Thanksgiving?
Well, first of all, of course, he pardoned his turkey, the White House turkey, the day before. And then I'm assuming that he had a sumptuous turkey dinner at Mar-a-Lago. But actually, what he really did, what really gives him a great amount of joy, is to go on social media and rant. And this is what he said. So this is what other people are tucking into their turkey, adding the condiments, holding hands around the table and saying thank you to all the great things that have happened in that year. Donald Trump said this: only, and then in caps, reverse migration can fully cure this situation. Other than that, happy Thanksgiving to all, except those that hate, steal, murder, and destroy everything that America stands for. You won't be here for long. End of quote. End of social media post. So I guess, he never takes any time off work, does he? He's always on the job.
Yesterday, I was watching the very long, as usual, cabinet meeting by Donald Trump, and then he took this turn about Somali people. And let's just listen to what he said.
I don't want them in our country, I'll be honest with you. Okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country.
Now, we actually aren't playing all of it, not because we want to sanitize it, but because it is just so offensive and people don't really want to listen to all of it. He talked about people in Somalia being garbage. He has this real thing for Representative Ilhan Omar, who is a US citizen, by the way, but he talks about people like her, other people from the Somali community going home. Like I said, he called them garbage. I mean, Matt, you have seen so much. You have heard so much. Do you still have the capacity to be shocked?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole point, isn't it? Just when you're getting used to the new normal of something that Trump has said, he says something else that makes you pay attention. It's all part of his attentional economy, the way he, grabs the headlines and grabs our minds. And it deflects perhaps from things that he doesn't want to talk about, like, Jeffrey Epstein, or the fairly miserable state of the economy, or, the cost of living or inflation, things like that. So he's very good at making everyone pivot to the thing he wants us all to talk about. Just want to say about the 29-year-old Afghan man, who, by the way, is a husband and a father of kids, who drove all the way, across the country to, allegedly commit this crime, to which he, by the way, has pleaded not guilty. He worked for the American forces while they were occupying Afghanistan for, I think, almost a decade, including at some stage for the CIA. He was brought in under a scheme that was started by Joe Biden after the chaotic departure from Afghanistan. And then actually his asylum claim was approved while Trump was in office. Because President Trump did go out of his way to blame, Afghans, this guy in particular, obviously, but also Afghans in general, for having been brought into America by Joe Biden. But actually, let's not forget that it was actually President Trump who first made the suggestion that America should leave Afghanistan many years ago. And this guy had his asylum papers approved under Trump when he was president this year. Having said that, this is an excuse for Donald Trump yet again to unleash on people that he likes to unleash on. And he does this at regular intervals, but every time he does it, it gets more violent.
I don't think it's a knee-jerk reaction to what happened in Washington, D.C. last week. I think it is the absolute driving ideology of this government to crack down on immigration in this way. But they are obviously using this as what they see as an opportunity. And, let's just pause for a minute and just talk about the two victims in all of this. Sarah Beckstrom, who was killed, was only 20, and Andrew Wolf, 24, has been fighting for his life. It was a terrible, terrible crime. As you say, he has pleaded not guilty to this, but it was a terrible crime. But I was standing in the briefing room in the White House on Monday, and I was packed in, because it's always completely packed with journalists. And Caroline Levitt, the press secretary, began by talking about the two National Guard officers who were killed and obviously very, very badly injured. And then she turned to what they really want to talk about. And I have to say, Matt, I'm not easily shocked, I would like to say, but I felt like really shocked by what I was hearing. I was standing there, I don't know if this makes a difference or not. You don't need to be an immigrant or a child of an immigrant to be shocked. But as a child of an immigrant, maybe I felt it even slightly sharper than I might have done. She talked about the disorder and violence, basically arguing this was unleashed by all Afghans. In fact, not just all Afghans. They were talking about immigration much more broadly by that. She was talking about people draining welfare. I think later on we'll get to some of the statistics about the reality of the economic impact of immigration. It came alongside, and I just want to read this out, and then I just want to ask you about it. Kristi Noem, the Secretary for Homeland Security, went on Twitter, and again, capacity to be shocked. You'd think be numbed after 20 odd years as a journalist. Still, I'm just totally shocked by it. I just met with the president. I'm recommending a full travel ban on every damn country that's been flooding our nation with killers, leechers, and entitlement junkies. Our forefathers built this nation on blood, sweat, and the unyielding love of freedom, not for foreign invaders to slaughter our heroes, suck dry our hard-earned tax dollars, or snatch the benefits owed to Americans. We don't want them, not one. And then yesterday, Donald Trump turning this to Somalis living in Minnesota. He's talking about revoking their temporary protected status, which is actually, we think, probably only relevant for a few hundred of the Somali community. The vast majority of them are American citizens, many of them born and bred in America. And he has absolutely gone for them in a kind of really shocking way. I mean, what do you think the impact of this will be for many of people in that community? And do you agree with me that it's not a knee-jerk reaction, that this runs through the thread of what they want to do as a government?
Well, remember, Donald Trump started his first political campaign in 2015 when he came down the golden escalator in Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue with a speech about Mexicans being murderers and rapists and bad hombres, and some of them are good people, he acknowledged. But that was his calling card to get into politics. That and the birther campaign against President Obama. He famously claimed that he shouldn't have been president because he was born outside America, which of course was nonsense. But he made the president proffer his birth certificate to prove him wrong. That's how he started. That's how it all began, 10 years ago. So he's been doing this ever since. As soon as he got into office in 2017, the first thing he did was ban immigrants from visitors from Muslim countries. He then put the whole green card process on hold. I know this because I was applying for a green card at the time because I thought I might want to go back to America at some stage. And suddenly my lawyer ran me and said, it's all been frozen. So he's been messing with, different levels of immigration, asylum seekers from desperate parts of the world, people who just want to work in America. He's been doing it all along. What's different now, I think, Anushka, is that first of all, it's confusing. It's a bit like the tariff policy. No one really knows where they stand at the moment because it's all so raw. And remember, this is policy that could potentially undo years of paying tons of money and going to lawyers, suddenly upended, or maybe not. It'll be challenged in the courts, I'm sure. Will the Supreme Court then rule with those courts or rule against them? We don't know. But if you're someone who's lived in the country legitimately, let alone illegitimately, you're going to feel really scared. So I think for a nation that is based on bring me your huddled masses, the famous inscription the Statue of Liberty, that is based on immigration. And this is one of the joys of America, one of its strengths. This is what had made America great. To see the whole structure of immigration undermined like this, I find deeply troubling. And I'm not even living there as an immigrant.
Obviously, the reaction this week has been specific things. They're going to re-examine all of the asylum claims of the Afghans who came in 2021. That, as you say, the actual decision on this man who has been suspected in this crime was made under Trump, but the scheme, I think it was called Operation Allies Welcome, happened under Joe Biden. And suddenly all of them are being tarred like this. So that's all being examined. Caroline Leavitt seemed to suggest that there had been national security warnings to the White House under Biden. I wrote to them and asked them about that because she said reportedly, as in the newspapers, I wrote to the White House and said, well, you must know about it if it was a warning to government. And they just directed me back to Caroline Leavitt's words. So no more detail on that. They're also, this is what he says, pausing all migration from third world countries. I mean, is there a kind of particular, definition of that? And then they're threatening a crackdown on the Somali population in Minnesota. They're talking about a case that involved fraud. There were dozens of Somalis who were caught up in that. And they're using that as an excuse to say this huge settled population, which, by the way, the vast majority of has been there for decades. I mean, these are people who came when the civil war was at its height in Somalia in the 1990s. These are not largely people who have come in the last few years. They want to do a crackdown there. And we've already seen, haven't we, the ICE raids around the country, people being literally snatched off the streets. And obviously they're getting very worried in Minnesota right now. So this threat and crackdown is in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Let's just hear how the Democratic mayors have reacted to this.
Our values and our commitment to the Somali community, to every community of immigrants and people in our city, is rock solid and will be unwavering. Our police, many of whom are Somali themselves, are trusted partners in keeping people safe. They will not collaborate with any federal agency around doing immigration enforcement work. Our city staff and our law enforcement will not ask the question as to whether an individual is documented or not. And by the way, there are more than 80,000 Somali people living in Minnesota. Almost all of them are both documented and citizens.
The last thing that we need is federal agents coming here, pretending that we should be afraid of somebody just based on the color of their skin, just based on what they look like, just based on what country their ancestors claim as honor as a motherland.
I mean, what the mayor just referred to is essentially that if you look different, different as in if you have dark skin, whether it's from Africa or Latin America, forget whether you're a convicted criminal or not, or whether you're there legally as an American citizen, you run the risk of getting arrested by ICE officials. And then you're in this sort of, terrible maelstrom of legal fees and going to judges and lawyers to try and get out of detention or deportation. And that's just not happened in such a random way before. And of course, I think a lot of it, Anushka, and I wonder what you think, is driven by the ideologue behind Donald Trump on matters immigration, one Stephen Miller. What do you think?
Yeah, this is his deputy chief of staff. And I think, his writing is all over this. And as I said before, not a new thing, something you reported on greatly in Trump 1.0, and now we're reporting again on in Trump 2.0, all over the executive orders. I mean, they had on day one signing executive orders, talking about an emergency on the southern border, an invasion. And I was really interested in a response that Stephen Miller actually made on social media to a Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative newspaper, article about all of this, which basically made the point that you don't punish everybody for one crime. You don't punish an entire, population. And also warnings about the fact that actually and again, we'll come to these stats. Immigration has been a huge economic boom for America over many years, and there is a positive to it. And he basically wrote back and said that this was the kind of big lie, if you like, about immigration, this idea that you're importing individuals. He basically said, no, you're importing societies, and made absolutely clear that he thought that the societies where these people were coming from were broken, and therefore they would break American society. And that is the thing that runs through all of this. I mean, my nature is to look at these things, not what Stephen Miller says, but, you know, what the government is doing, and assume that there isn't a kind of bubbling racist ideology below it. But it is quite hard to think that when you hear what they're saying again and again. And, you know, just one of the examples of what they did with an executive order immediately, and now they're really hammering down on this, is they've basically closed the door. This is a predominantly Christian country that has basically closed the door on people fleeing persecution. Their target for 2026 is 7,500. And Caroline Levitt was very open about this at the briefing this week. Vast majority of them, only white people fleeing discrimination, you know, is what they say, farmers from South Africa, which I do think really shows you this. And they want to do stuff retrospectively. They want to review green cards. Trump says he wants to take the permanent out of permanent residency. I mean, the Somali population in Minnesota, which is very large because a lot of people settled and then people came to the same place. Lots of young people, lots of people have been reacting to this. I think people are quite bemused almost about his obsession about this particular population. I mean, there's lots of humor if people are looking for it on TikTok and Instagram, people making fun of him over all of this. A lot of these people are naturalized citizens or just born and bred Americans. And, you know, it's just worth just pausing for a minute. The thing that he's talking about, temporary protected status, TPS, is something that is put in place for people who've come from countries where, you know, there are ongoing civil wars. Things are really still very unstable. One big population is Haitian communities around America. I did, you know, with the team, we went to Charleroi,
the ones that are eating the dog and eating the
Pennsylvania,
cats, you know,
which Donald Trump basically repeated this disgusting lie and myth about eating their pets in Springfield, Ohio. I went to Charleroi in Pennsylvania about this. People were absolutely terrified because you talk about TPS like it's just a new thing. People had been there, you know, since, you know, 2010 in the case of Haiti, but I almost don't want to talk too much about TPS because it's not really about TPS, because the vast majority of Somalis in America are Americans. And, you know, they don't want you to think about that or know that. And they're just going after them in a very brutal way. I mean, it is worth saying, and we can both talk about this, is obviously people have a right to be upset and angry and scared about immigration levels. And there was huge immigration over the southern border under the Joe Biden years. And one of the things they did was they ended up with a large amount of immigration in some of the more democratic cities. And actually, the population was shocked by that. Do you think that was a big contributor to Donald Trump winning again?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, the one thing I heard throughout the campaign was cost of living, immigration, over and over again. And, you know, from some Republicans, it was on the immigration front. If this isn't sorted out, if he doesn't come into office again, this will spell the end of the American way of life. It'll be the end of our republic. It'll be the end of democracy. And I think one of the things that we fail to appreciate in this nation of immigrants founded on immigration is that the numbers of people coming across from south of the border, from the Western Hemisphere, from Latin America, where they really only speak one language. I mean, it's mostly Spanish. Some of them, obviously, in Brazil speak Portuguese. That has changed the kind of culture of America more than previous waves of immigration from different countries. You had the Irish, and before that, of course, the English, then you had the Italians, and then you had people from all over Europe, and there were sort of pockets of immigration, and they've still left their imprint. So Minnesota, which he talked about earlier, which has a big Somali community, also had a big German community, and you can still see the evidence of that, you know, in St. Paul and Minneapolis. The same thing in Wisconsin, lots of German-themed restaurants with waitresses wearing dirndls and so on. But nothing was sort of overwhelming. And I think for people, if you talk to people in the Trump administration, you talk to Republicans who want to turn the clock back to the 1950s and 60s. This isn't just about a perceived alleged racism. It's also about a panic, an actual panic that they're being overwhelmed by a Spanish-speaking culture and civilization. And if you go to, Texas or to California or to Florida and you ring up any public agency, what you hear on the phone in Spanish is "Oprima uno para inglés y dos para español." The first language of reference is Spanish. You press 1 to speak English, press 2 to continue in Spanish. And that is it's something that a lot of Americans aren't used to. And I want to ask you, Anushka, as someone who's just arrived in America, you've only been there a couple of months with your family. Does this immigration stuff make you personally feel uncomfortable about being there?
Well, I have been surprised by how things are a lot worse than I expected them to be when I came, and how scared people are. People who are legally in this country are worried about this, because nobody knows what is going to happen at any moment. And yeah, I think it
Do you
is.
think
I
that's
think
the
it
point
is.
of the Trump policy, to make people feel insecure, even if they've been there for years as American citizens?
Yeah, and also I think he is responding to a genuine fear in the country about the levels of immigration. And, I often think about this, comparing it to reporting I've done in the UK. I remember in 2016 making a film about immigration ahead of Brexit, and I went to 6 different parts of the country, and I heard a lot of people who were really, really scared about immigration. I remember being on an open top UKIP bus when I was reporting, talking to UKIP politicians, and people were cheering this open top bus. And I remember standing in a square in Lee in the Northwest, and people were like screaming at me about immigration, including, by the way, one person who was Polish and one person who was a black woman who was, the child of immigrants. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, obviously, and I would like to talk about some of the stats. Obviously, some of the things that people are scared about are not true, but some of the things that people are scared about are true. I went to Peterborough, where the level of scale of immigration had been so fast and so kind of discombobulating for the local population that people genuinely had seen everything change around them, the type of shops that were around them. I went to the doctor's surgery, and the doctors were like, we're very pro-immigration, but it has really changed the challenges that we're trying to face with here. The school had more churn. And when you look at the stats, it's very easy to just sort of scream about one side or the other, scream falsely, as some in Trump's administration do, that they're taking all our benefits. I mean, I think we could actually fact check. I think Donald Trump talked about immigrants sort of, earning $30,000 and taking $50,000. I think we can quite flatly say that is not true. If you look at cost and benefit in that way, immigrants hugely contribute to society in America. They're also 60% less likely, by the way, to commit crimes than people who are born Americans. But they wouldn't have you think that. But it's also true that, the people who shout at the other end of the spectrum on this, they just put in more money, and it's completely untrue that there are any challenges. Also not true, because many of those statistics don't take into account the impact on public services, the impact on housing, other things that are quite hard for you to kind of, get your teeth around. But America has nevertheless been built on immigration. The thing I find really quite hard to kind of fathom, which is quite different, I guess, to the UK, is that every single person who's talking about how immigrants are ruining our country is the, daughter or son of immigrants somewhere along the line. And like I say, the stats do show that overall immigration has brought economic, booms to America.
But you can't imagine America without it. But I mean, in terms of what you've described, you experienced when you were, doing your films and you were reporting in Britain about immigration and the rise of the Brexit Party, now the Reform Party. Of course, in Germany, it's very similar, and in France, and in Italy. Every country is dealing with the issue of immigration in a slightly different way. And in every country, there's a common theme, and that includes the United States, where you have communities where immigrants have suddenly arrived in very large numbers. The feelings against them are much stronger than they are in big cities like New York or London or or Berlin or Paris, where you've always had a real melting pot of different societies and different immigrants in different communities. And it's that sort of rapid arrival whether it's a town in the northeast of England or somewhere in the middle of Kentucky, where people show up suddenly and there's a quorum of them and they speak a different language and they worship in a slightly different way, that is where you have an issue. And I think what I always thought was true about America, and maybe it's no longer true, is that America could filter these people coming in, these outsiders, and say, this is what we're all about. As long as you sign up to that, that A4 piece of paper, the Constitution, which of course everyone swears allegiance to when they become naturalized. I find that term extraordinary. Naturalized Americans, in other words, they become citizens. You defend the Constitution that defends your right to be yourself and to be different. That was the key. And no other country had that recipe for bringing people in. And I think fundamentally that is now what is at stake across the board.
The big question, though, is people have very genuine fears. And the reason they do is because their own lives have become very insecure. Economic affordability is clearly a huge thing here in the US. The Republicans have actually won an election in Tennessee overnight, but by a massively reduced margin than they would have done. So I think Democrats in this country are quite hopeful that there may be an answer. But all the world over, including Keir Starmer in the UK, grappling with how do we deal with immigration. I mean, just one thing in terms of a response from the left. I think this kind of focus on affordability is their best hope in a way. I always remember I was speaking to people all over the country in the UK about immigration. And I always remember this woman just saying to me, my daughter hasn't got a school place. My daughter hasn't got a school place. And it's the immigrants, It's the immigrants. And I was thinking, there's a way to solve this. Make sure her daughter has a school place. Solve the problems that people are feeling insecure about. And then you will get less of this anger and this hatred. But also, it is also, okay for people to feel angry and upset about immigration and for us to, talk about how they can deal with that. What's not okay is to attack an entire population in the way as is happening right now and make people feel just quite so scared. And that could be politically interesting because Donald Trump won a lot of votes from Hispanic voters in the last election, and the early signs, and particularly in those recent elections that we've talked about in recent weeks where, Zoran Mamdani and others won against Republicans, is that actually it does look like there is a shift away from Trump with those Hispanic voters. And there was one thing the president said yesterday that I thought, you've got to be careful saying things like this. He said, affordability is a hoax. And what he meant by that was people are not feeling, we're solving it all. People can afford things.
The broad theme, I think, for all this, whether you're talking about this country or the United States, is that the big conversation these days is between societies that we want to become more closed and those that are still happy to be open, whether it's to immigration or to trade or to international institutions. And America, a country that had always been, for better or for worse, an example of openness, has done the opposite. Battened down the hatches, pulled up the drawbridge, whether it's on trade or on immigration or an engagement with the rest of the planet in international institutions. That is really, I think, for me, the essence of Trumpism. And, it's a new reality that we all have to get used to. And in various ways, different foreign leaders are trying to prise those doors open again. But ultimately, the direction is to close them. But all this, Anushka, is detracting from the spirit of the season, which of course is not just Thanksgiving, but you've got Christmas coming up. I can only imagine looking at the Oval Office that it'll be even richer and more, undigestible than it has been on previous occasions.
Yeah, I mean the White House decorations are quite something. 75 wreaths, 51 Christmas trees, 700 feet of garland, 2,000 strands of light, more than, this is a good one, 10,000 butterflies, and especially for you, Matt, 120 pounds of
10,000 butterflies. Are these chocolate butterflies or real butterflies? Or Mar-a-Lago gold butterflies?
Yeah, this has got question mark on my link. Can somebody let me know? Are they real butterflies?
I have to say, one of the great, we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about stuff we don't particularly like. One thing I really, really liked about America and I really miss is this sort of other customs, the traditions. And, I'm not a believer, or I'm nominally Christian. I think that's what it says on my birth certificate. But I go to church to look at some nice windows or art and maybe listen to a bit of music, but I'm not even remotely religious. But I do get swept up in that spirit at this time of year. And of course, it's not all religious. Some of it is very secular, like Thanksgiving. But these sort of holidays, they really punctuate an American calendar. And again, it's so weird that you have an administration that's prepared to shred all the things that we've got used to tear up the Constitution to tiny little pieces and challenge all the nostrums and all the things that many people took for granted. But at the same time, you still got all these traditions. And America is sort of baked in those traditions, even if they sometimes involve putting marshmallows on top of sweet potatoes. That's also a tradition.
That is it for this week. I do hope that people are enjoying the show. If they are, they can subscribe, they can follow. It would be hugely, hugely appreciated by us if you do that. You can also use the comment section wherever you watch or listen to send us comments, and we can talk about some of them on here.
We can indeed. That's all from us. Thanks from me, Matt in London.
And me, Anushka, in Washington, DC. See you next week.
See you next week.